Today I'm going to talk about playful online learning, and I'm going to look at some of my heady successes and abject failures of the last 2 years. And this is an interactive story of my journey through playful learning of the last 2 years. And I'm going to need your help navigating through this material because I've prepared far too much. So let's have a look at what I'm going to talk about today. Firstly, I'm going to talk briefly about why be playful in the first place. And then I've tried to group my experiences into themes. And shortly you'll be seeing a poll appearing and you're going to vote on which themes you want me to talk about the most. So the themes are personalisation and scaffolding learning, community building, crowdsourcing student knowledge and collaborative learning, analog versus digital engagement, utter silliness. And then at the end, after I'm finished talking about the themes, I'm going to give you a big list of playful resources that you're welcome to take and use in your own practice. And we'll have some questions and feedback. So hopefully a poll will appear shortly. I think you have 2 votes. So please vote for the 2 things that you want me to talk about the most. And while you're voting, I'm going to talk about why we use playful learning in the first place. Okay, so why be playful? Play can inform, it can teach people things. It can also really help to engage the students, and it can be persuasive. Play is a persuasive medium. Play can create safe spaces for students to experiment and practice skills and to have failure. Games and playful activities create what's called the magic circle of play, in which you can do all sorts of things, and students who are used to being constantly assessed for things can fail safely. Play is by its nature interactive, so learning has to be active. So there's active exploration. Play in teams can also facilitate social interaction. And because of the aforementioned experimentation and failure, it can build resilience. And of course, play can be very motivating. And finally, play can stimulate creativity in our learners. And the last thing I want to say is I don't have time to talk about this just now, but playful learning has rigor. It is not just us messing about and being silly. And if you have any doubt or skepticism about that, I can really recommend this book over here, Playful Learning, Events and Activities to Engage Adults. And I can also recommend the Playful Learning Association. So if you don't believe me that play has rigor, please engage with those communities. Okay, do we have any poll results yet? Let me have a look. So I'm going to take my immensely good digital tool of a pen and paper and just note them down. Oh, you have not disappointed. ConnectMore. I like the utter silliness is coming in second. Analog versus digital, 3 and 4. Okay, lovely. Okay, so the winner is personalisation. Okay, you can take the poll away now. Thank you. All right, so personalisation and scaffolding learning. Each theme, I'm going to talk about my experiences, but I've also got a provocation for you to think about and a question to kind of just get your mind going about the things that we have to consider under the theme. So I'm going to talk about how digital engagement can provide additional opportunities for personalization and scaffolding. And the provocation I'm asking you to think about is how can we balance personal digital pathways through learning material with the advantages that we get from face-to-face scaffolding with students. Okay, so the creative thinking quest. I'm going to talk a little bit about a tool I created called the Creative Thinking Quest. There's a link here, and it will be in the slides afterwards if you want to try it out. So this is an interactive learning tool, which is a digital choose your own adventure. So you click on things and you are taken to different pages depending on the options that you pick. I created it using a tool called Twine, which is an interactive hypertext tool that's used a lot for interactive narrative fiction. But I embedded into the hypertext a huge range of other learning tools, such as thing links and little mini games and kind of random wheels that you can spin to get a random answer. So that my learners take on, and I should say I created this for my own students who are postgraduate students doing a master's research project. And this entire creative thinking quest is based around creating a good research design for a project. So my learners take on the role of adventurers, and the quest is based on their personal situation, what they want from their research project, and how developed their research project ideas already are. And I use fictional obstacles, such as, you know, a very basic narrative, you know, you need to get across a river, a tree is blocking your path, that kind of thing. And that's used to engage the players in different learning activities that are appropriate to the stage of research design that they're currently at based on their choices. This is a little glimpse of what it looks like in Twine. So each little square is a piece of learning content. And as you can see, it's very big. You can see that this is about half of what's there. So each square is the learning content, and the links between them are the kind of hypertext that takes you around the structure. And what I would say is that this this took a very long time to create, and because I wasn't sure it was going to work when I was designing it, I actually did it outside of work time, and then I brought it into work when I was confident that it was going to be successful. So in that sense, it was an experiment for me to create this thing in the first place, and it took a really long time. And I had to really think carefully about how to structure all this content to best serve the learning outcomes, and how to create kind of paths and gateway content that all students would see no matter what their journey through the material. So structuring something like this is not a trivial task. Why did I take this approach in the first place? And what are the characteristics of doing quest-based learning? Well, the primary reason is that it allows the students to personalize and have agency over their learning pathway. And this was particularly important for me because my cohort that I designed this game for is very, very diverse in terms of its previous experience of academia and of academic research. So it allows the students to personalize their learning activities. It's very active and it's very exploratory, quite literally exploratory in this case, as they click on things and they don't know where they're going. And it's very closely linked and relevant to their research idea. At every point during this quest, they're asked to make notes and create content for their project idea. It's not generic. I'm proposing that this kind of thing is self-scaffolding. Now, I've put a question mark next to that because I don't really know that for sure. I'm proposing that because the quest prompts learners to return and do things again if they're not sure of things, or to skip certain sections if they don't need them, that it can kind of provide us a sort of scaffolding. But I don't know that for sure because I'm not there when they're doing this quest. It's done in their own time. I hope that the quest increases motivation because I've used this kind of deliberately slightly silly narrative. And I included a lot of gamification techniques. So these digital badges that you see on the screen. And I created a leaderboard of badges using a website called flippity.net so that my students could kind of have a leaderboard and compare themselves. So in terms of usage, what do I know about this? I only released the quest properly in January this year, so it's very much a work in progress. And I had to teach myself some JavaScript to capture some basic usage data. So this is a graph showing how different users currently have moved through the material. I also released a user survey to get qualitative feedback and much more detailed feedback on the quest. And I'm presenting the results from this this year at various other conferences. Get in touch if you want to know what they are. But at the moment, I don't really know that much about how people are using it. And I was particularly interested in finding out about these concepts of personalization and scaffolding. So watch this space, results will be forthcoming, but I will summarize some of what I've learned so far at the end of this section. More about scaffolding then. Now, I'm sure most of you have heard of escape type games. And I thought I'd use these as an example of scaffolding learning. So how do we scaffold learning when it's based on puzzles. So just before the pandemic in 2019, I created a physical escape game, which was based on the induction to the library at the Glasgow School of Art, my institution. And it was great. And it had, you know, envelopes taped to the bottom of people's chairs that they discovered and jigsaws and all this sort of thing. And then, of course, 2020 happened. And I converted it into a digital version of the escape room. And I just consider this to not be successful. I consider this to be a failure. Why is that? Well, the problem with any kind of puzzle-based learning is that if the player isn't good at solving puzzles, they can't progress, and therefore the learning stops. So you have to think really carefully about how you balance the puzzles with the learning content. Now, students can still do this, and you could argue it's still better than listening to a PowerPoint about a library induction. But what I did is I was so scared of the students sitting alone in their own homes, getting stuck and not being able to complete the game, that I made everything far too easy. And really, it ended up being not much of a game at all. It was more like a glorified worksheet to work through the content. So I don't consider it to be very successful. On the other hand, I created some similar kind of games for my child's school. And these were based on mathematicians. And for some reason, these were incredibly successful and have been downloaded thousands of times. And the difference between this example and the previous example is I think that these were designed to be done with scaffolding, with an adult. So they were designed to be done as lockdown activities where the parent would support the child in doing the puzzles. And I think that that's the difference in these two examples. And that's the trick of puzzle-based learning, is to incorporate scaffolding within the design of it. I don't know that for sure, but that's my impression. Okay, so what have I learned about personalization and scaffolding? So there is sometimes a tension between letting people choose their learner journeys, which we can do easily with digital tools, and scaffolding their learning or supporting their learning. So you need to think both about personalization and about scaffolding as two sides of the same coin, because we as tutors and as resource creators don't have that feedback when learners are doing the learning in isolation. And I don't really know how to solve this. So if you do, please let me know. Secondly, attrition can be very high. That's one thing I definitely noticed from my creative thinking quest, is that a lot of people thought, oh, that looks interesting. Oh, yeah, that looks really good. They click on it, but they don't actually engage much with the learning content. So lots of people just peruse it and then leave. Thirdly, gamification is not motivating for everyone. I was under the impression that people would quite like the digital badges, but actually most people who responded to the survey said they weren't very interested in digital badges. And finally, if you're doing anything with escape games or puzzle-based learning, they're really hard to balance and scaffold. And that's why all the literature on creating educational escape rooms or similar type things recommends testing, 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 testing. Okay, that's the end of that section. Coming in second was utter silliness. I'm so glad you chose this. Okay, so utter silliness. And your provocation here is, when is being silly beneficial and when should we really avoid a bit of silliness? Hopefully my video will appear in a second. Okay, so remember summer 2020 when you were all making all your online lecture videos and you got a bit bored?
That's all from me for this video. Please do watch the next two on Lit Reviews. Thanks for listening. Once again, thanks very much for listening. Thanks for listening.
Right, well, I mean, I can't see any of your faces. I can only hope that you find that as funny as I did. If I'm being honest, I didn't do these things at the end of the videos for the students. I did them for myself because I wanted to keep my own motivation and enthusiasm going. And I just thought it would be funny at the end of a 20-minute online video about literature review, which is not the most thrilling topic, to give the students a little reward for kind of having got through the video. So I put all these Easter eggs at the end of my learning videos, and they are very silly. And what I learned is, well, you've got to keep yourself enthused if you want to be a good teacher. And some students did get in touch to say that they really liked the Easter eggs, but how do I know if all of the students actually thought that that was appropriate? And I would like to, at this point, bring in the idea that play and playfulness is a privilege. And there are definite differences in attitudes to play across different personalities, different cultures, different age groups even. And I'd like to recommend the work of Andrew Walsh, who's done a lot of work on giving students permission to play. And if you're interested in this concept of kind of encouraging students and giving them that permission to use playful learning, then please do check out his work. Okay, that's a short section. Coming in third was analog versus digital engagement. Okay, here we are. So this is some reflections that I've got from my experience of taking analog games that I used to run in the classroom as physical games into the online environment. The provocation here is have a think about my experiences as I describe them of online games, and think about whether they apply to digital engagement in general, or is this specific to game-based learning? Okay, so I have two games that I use a lot in my teaching, and one is called How to Fail Your Research Degree. It's a game that I developed myself for my own postgraduate cohort. If you go to the website, it's on the slides here. You can get a copy for yourself for free, or you can buy a pre-printed copy. And the second one is the methods game, the subtle methods game, which I did not create. It was done by Eleanor Hannon and Charles Neame, who at the time were at the Manchester Met, I think, or Manchester Met University. So I use them a lot, and they're card-based games. And what did I do during lockdown? So I found a platform called playingcards.io, on which you can create custom board games, and it's reasonably intuitive. It's a nice kind of interface, and you can just upload all your own files and create your own games. So I delivered them through playingcards.io, and then I created a lot of related activities, which were delivered via Miro, which is an online whiteboard tool for those of you who haven't come across Miro. So the games themselves were through this platform, and then the debrief, the kind of reinforcement learning activities, were done on a digital whiteboard. Now, this is a complex image. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all of it. The categories of interest, in my opinion, when we convert an analog game into a digital format, fall into four main categories. We have our pedagogical concerns. How does the learning translate in those environments? We've got technical concerns, which is how are you actually delivering it through the digital platform? Logistical concerns, which are more relevant than I thought they were before I tried it for myself. And finally, the social issues. So I'm not going to talk about everything on this board. This was done at a previous presentation. I'm just going to pull out the things that I think are of the most interest. And firstly, in terms of pedagogy, and very, very importantly, it's how do your game mechanics translate from the physical, kinesthetic, embodied, playing cards, rolling dice, looking people in the eyes, round a table kind of gameplay? How do they translate into the digital sphere? And as they translate into the digital sphere, do they still deliver the learning outcomes that your game was intended to deliver in the physical space? And that's a big one. In terms of technical concerns, the biggest one, and I touched on this before, is that the lack of feedback to the tutor. You know, you'll have experienced this yourself in terms of lecturing on Zoom to a load of little black boxes. You don't get any feedback from the players in terms of either how well they understand the rules of the game or how well they understand the learning content that you're trying to deliver. So you get no feedback, and this risks that the students get no reinforcement. Then logistical concerns, and this was the thing well, it's one of the two things that surprised me the most. So firstly, time. It's all about time. So you've got all these time overheads. So there's the time overhead of the tutor, yes, you setting up the game. It takes ages to redo an analog game into a digital format and upload it all and arrange it all properly on the screen. You've also got the time overhead of arranging your students into teams, which takes much longer than it does sitting around a table. You know, you have to set up breakout groups. You have to make sure that the right students go into the right places and that breakout group 1 is all forming into team 1 in the digital sphere. And that all takes time. And then, of course, there's the time overhead of the learners becoming familiar with both the rules of the game and the digital environment. So all of this takes a lot of time. And then the final issue here is the emergent behaviors. And this is really interesting. So students in an online environment behave very differently than they do in a physical environment. And I had students stealing cards from each other, blatantly ignoring the rules of the game. If they drew a card and they were supposed to use it, but they didn't like it, they just threw it away because nobody can tell. It's just a load of cursors on a screen. So there was a lot of emergent gameplay behaviors that you simply wouldn't see sitting around a table playing a game. And I thought that was very interesting. What did I learn about analog versus digital? Well, it's really hard to replicate face-to-face game-based learning in an online environment, and it is highly likely to change the learning behaviors of your students. Do consider if your game is still going to be better than the alternatives. It may be that it just doesn't work well in a digital environment. Then selecting the platform requires this balance between the pedagogical, technical, social, and usability requirements, and you will lose teaching time. So leave way more time for familiarization than you think. An online game where a student has to learn a new online platform, a new set of game rules, and the actual learning content that's the whole point of this exercise is probably not going to be a good experience. So keep it simple. Simple is better. And then finally, even when we're not in a pandemic, consider if this kind of isolated gameplay mode, this solo isolated mode, is actually the best format that supports your learning outcomes. Oh, and an aside, make backups of everything. I found out by chance that the platform deletes your game after 2 weeks of it not being used, and was panicked and backed everything up, and now I can just reinstall it when I need to. Okay, so I have run out of time, so I'm going to move to my summary section. The key takeaways from taking playful learning online then. So I would propose that playfulness is really even more important in the digital sphere than it is in face-to-face teaching. This is because it can complement and reinforce teaching and learning activities, but only if you design it well and you design it for that purpose. Playfulness can address deficits in engagement from students, in their motivation to participate, and of course in well-being. You know, it can be fun and social, and it can add to well-being in times of isolation. Embrace experimentation and failure and learn from it yourself. Playful activities should always arise from your intended learning and engagement outcomes. So the key golden rule here is no gimmicks. Do not use a playful learning tool or technique because it's cool. Use it because it does what you want to do better than any other method does. Okay, I'm not going to read these, but they're in the slides. I just want to make you aware that I've got a big list of free stuff that you can have. So there's a big list of games here, and a big list of other kind of playful learning resources and links and all sorts of stuff. So please do have a look at my slides after, which I think they're made available. And thank you very much. Let's take some questions.
Thank you so much, Daisy. You don't realise how disappointed I am that I didn't have like a silly hat to hand or something like that to sort of go into this session, this Q&A session. But yeah, really inspirational. Thank you so much. We do have some questions for you. The first one that came through, you've mentioned an awful lot about the importance of the prep and getting things right. You also mentioned that it takes a really long time in terms of creating particularly the creative thinking quest. And that sounds great, but how long is a long time?
Oh gosh, now you're asking. So Twine itself is very easy to learn to use. It's simple. Get the technical side is not what takes all the time. It depends on your learning content, is the honest answer to that question. So my creative thinking quest, it was designed to take students from having literally no idea what they were going to do for a project, brainstorming, thinking of feasible ideas, all that stuff, all the way through to creating a full project brief with aims and objectives and, all the detail that has to go into research project brief. So it was big. Now, if you wanted to do learning content that was much simpler and less expansive than that, then of course it wouldn't take as long. But the thing that took me the longest was just thinking and mapping out with post-it notes how I was going to structure that content so I could ensure meaningful personalization, first of all, but I could also ensure that students were exposed to the critical lessons that they all needed to see. So I would suggest get some post-its on a desk somewhere, map it all out, make sure that you've checked all your pathways through it and that you're happy with them. That's the bit that takes the time, the technical stuff less so.
Great, thank you. My colleague Chris Thompson has a question for you as well in relation to playful learning. So what connections, if any, do you see between playful learning and storytelling?
Yeah, good question. Yes, so narrative often appears in games, and a lot of people in the game-based learning research community kind of see it as integral. Games must have a narrative. Now, I don't agree with that. I like puzzles and Tetris and things like that, but narrative is a big part of game-based learning. And I think if we consider it from why is it important? It's because storytelling and narratives, I think, are inherently motivating and inherently engaging. You want to hear the end. Yeah. You want to get to the end. It's satisfying to have. So firstly, engagement, because you want to take part in that story. And even more so if it's an interactive story that you have agency over. But secondly, you want to reach the end and you want to see how it all turns out. So I think, yeah, there's a very strong link. And one of my colleagues actually specializes in narrative games. I'm not personally a specialist in it, but yeah, it's a great question and a good link to make. Storytelling and games are very similar.
And an interesting question from Martin here. Have you convinced other staff to adopt these tools and methods?
Yeah, so this is a great question. Now, the Playful Learning Association that I mentioned briefly earlier, there's a lot of people in that network who do much more work than I do on this topic, but it's about this idea of play not just being rigorous, but being seen to be rigorous. And as game-based learning researchers, you do sometimes struggle to be taken seriously. Now, I don't experience this myself in my department, but I have spoken to people who said that managers just don't believe that this is a rigorous method and they don't believe that it works. And it comes back to this idea of permission to play, being signposted, firstly, that this is meaningful and useful as a technique, as a methodology, and then actually being invited in the right way to participate in it themselves. And that really varies between people. And there's no one method that works for everybody. So to answer the question, yes, I have. It's kind of reaching out from my department and into other parts of my institution. And I'm hoping that people do see the rigor in what I'm doing. but for some people it's a struggle, and that's the honest answer.
Yeah, come back. I mean, Alison raised a point as well about one of your early slides where there was a chart. I think it was in the Twine example, where there seemed to be a dip in engagement between some of the chapters on there, and that might have been because of the type of activity. But it also, I'm actually wondering whether you've noticed anything around engagement, what your observations have been. Does this type of learning actually increase engagement, or do you get a big cohort of people that go in, I'm struggling, this isn't for me?
Yeah, okay, so good question. It is hard to figure this stuff out because the data is hard to acquire. So what I'm certain of is that lots of people go, oh, that looks amazing, click, and then that's it. That they don't really do it. Now with the creative learning quest, that could be because it's a teacher going, oh, can I use this with my students? Click on it. Oh, right, yeah, that looks good. And then they go away and they use it at a different time. So there's definitely a huge drop off of people who are just curious versus people who are actually using the tool for the purpose it's intended for. The dip that you saw on the graph was actually due to the personalized pathway. So that chapter 3 is at the end of the I have no idea what I'm doing chapter. And the big rise after that is that, no, I already have some idea of a research project. So that's new users coming in chapter 4. It's not actually a dip because it's choose your own adventure. Yeah, that didn't really answer your question, Alison, but yeah, some people, it's rare to find people who absolutely don't want to play. They do exist. Most people are extremely positive about play. However, I will say that failure is a bit more divisive. A lot of people like to play and win, but I use failure and productive failure a lot in my own games. And I mean, my game is called How to Fail Your Research Degree, and it's based on this idea of threats and risks and horrible things that happen to you that might make you fail. And some people don't like that as an approach. I had a member of staff saying, oh, couldn't you just make it all a bit more positive? But most people, because it's done in a humorous way, in an abstract way, most people engage with it quite well. But yeah, like I said, not everybody.
Okay, excellent. And we've also just a question coming from Jane, who's saying, do you think that playful learning online may work better in a virtual world or a virtual reality format? Jane's had some success previously with games in Second Life, for example, and exploring virtual reality formats like escape rooms, but team-based. So it's taking that game into that VR environment.
I'm not sure if you mean a VR environment with a headset or a 3D environment like Second Life. So yeah, I think social environments can be very, very successful. Again, the answer to this question depends on the learning outcomes. Yeah, some games work brilliantly with a student. 5 minutes on the bus. Here's my mobile phone. I'll just do it. I'll learn a bit. I'll repeat it. I'll reinforce my learning. Some learning outcomes are absolutely unsuited to solo digital casual play, and they need dialogic learning. They need social. They need eye contact. They need kind of peer-to-peer stuff. So every game, every playful activity should be driven by the learning outcomes and by the learning behaviors that you want to provoke that lead you to those outcomes. So yeah, absolutely. Some things will work fantastically, either in VR or in kind of social 3D environments, and some will work better as just me and my headphones and my phone.
I've been skipping through the discussion forum as well as the Q&A, and I think you're certainly, I've got a lot of enthusiasm engendered in the room. A lot of people are sort of agreeing that maybe appropriate silliness and that removing that fear of failure is certainly a great approach. We've also, I think Liz Parcell has picked up that you were probably the first person to play an accordion at a Jisc event.
Well, that's outrageous, and I say more accordions at Jisc events from now on.
Yeah, so and it's also pointed out that we think that it's important to make yourself real and be human in the online space. Playfulness and silliness is a vehicle for that. So
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah.
This is bonus content for the ConnectMore22 presentation. These two themes are the ones that were not covered in the live presentation. So firstly, community building. And I'm going to talk about how digital playfulness can help to address a deficit in a sense of community. And the provocation here is playfulness enough to create the communities that we need? So this is going to be a lightning tour of some of the things I did and my opinions about them. Feel free to disagree with me. So firstly, some do's. So do incorporate a range of tools into your virtual learning environments and into your online teaching. I set up some discussion boards with prompts to use them, and my students completely ignored them. They just did not feel that that was where they wanted community engagement to happen. However, my students really liked the Slack and Discord boards that we set up within my department. So do try and create environments that your students will actually use for community building, but be aware that they might have an additional burden on tutors if you're trying to keep up with them. Breakout groups, of course, most people are familiar and have used breakout groups already in their teaching. I just wanted to say that I had mixed reactions to breakout groups. Some students absolutely loved them and found that it was a great opportunity to be more active and be more engaged in smaller groups. But on the other hand, some students said that they found them extremely stressful and they didn't like interacting in breakout groups at all. Padlet, we used a lot of Padlet, which is a new platform. And I would say that Padlet worked exceptionally well at creating groups who could collaborate together on creative projects. It simultaneously helps students to see the whole community work that's going on, but to also kind of work together in groups on things that they were actively developing and documenting as they went along. And of course, the chat in any platform, the chat is probably the most used tool. And again, this is something that students tend to quite like, so that they don't have to turn their microphones on to speak to you. But again, it's an additional cognitive burden to the tutor who's trying to present material to also keep an eye on the chat, as I'm sure you've experienced yourselves. Another do is use playful interludes and check in regularly with your students. This is a picture of Padlet being used in the group creative process that I just discussed before, but also I used Padlet to do some of these playful interludes in terms of a playful induction for our at the start of the year, our department ran inductions to the whole department on Padlet. And you can see here there's a mixture of kind of important things that we need to know about people with more playful activities like drawing a doodle or finding out if people are dog person or cat person, but also mixing in some of this kind of important content that they might need to know as they progress in their studies, such as how to get images that are not protected by copyright and to fairly use them. Okay, so some don'ts then. Don't assume that every method will work for every student. So try to mix it up. And this is because I found that no method works for every student and that some methods can be more divisive than others. Don't try and force it. Don't force playfulness onto people. If they're not wanting to engage in it, it will not be meaningful for them if you kind of force them to do something. So my advice here is to have an opt-out activity that is still meaningful for people who don't want to engage with the playful exercise that you've designed. And their reasons don't really matter. It doesn't, it doesn't matter why they're not being playful or not feeling playful on that particular occasion. But do have an opt-out or an alternative that gives them the same learning outcomes, but is less kind of overtly playful or less silly if it's a silly activity. And if somebody's just not engaging, don't try and force them to. So what did I learn about playful digital communities then? Well, definitely people engage in different ways online than they do in person. and different people engage with different activities in different ways. So no method will suit every single one of your students. One thing I want to emphasize is that really leaning into digital accessibility was hugely useful and has made me a better teacher for all of my students. One example here is subtitling. You know, subtitling is very, very important for students who have English as an additional language, but it's also really useful for students with neurodivergence or auditory processing. And it's fantastically useful for students to go back and revise later, because they can play your video at 3 times speed and read the text on the screen, read the subtitles, instead of having to listen to the video at its original speed. So do best practice for accessibility, because it makes it better for everybody, not just for the students who strictly need those accessibility tools like subtitling. And then finally, our students are really keen to get back to in-person teaching and learning communities, but let's make sure that we don't throw away everything we learned from this pandemic and all the new skills that we've developed over the last few years. Let's bring them with us back into face-to-face teaching. Okay, so the next theme that I didn't get time to look at in the live recording is to do with crowdsourcing student knowledge for collaborative learning. So I'm going to look at how digital tools can provide the freedom to share and experiment and create these opportunities for really collaborative learning when we use them. And the provocation here is there are just so many ways of doing this. So how do we choose the best tools? So have a think about that as I continue. So what's the best tool for the job? And I'm going to just look at a few examples of things I did and explain why I used them and question if they were the best tool for the job. So game-based learning, using teams in particular. And I talked about this in the game-based learning aspect of this presentation in terms of differences between analog and digital. But I want to talk here about the general reasons why I like to use game-based learning, and in particular team-based game-based learning. So it encourages students to discuss amongst themselves on game strategies, and this encourages dialogic learning. It also helps with the idea of a group identity and a shared responsibility over the success or failure for that particular learning outcome. And of course, like I talked about before, it's much harder to achieve during on lockdown and where we're teaching in remote situations than in face-to-face teaching. So I used all of these kind of strategic conversions of the physical to the digital when I moved these games into the online sphere. And as much as possible, I tried to preserve this idea of dialogic learning and shared collaboration towards a gameplay goal, which of course has a learning outcome attached to it. So a few more tools then. I used Slido, which is often used for managing questions in conference scenarios, but I used it instead to allow students to post their draft research questions and then vote on the ones that they wanted me to talk about the most. And it's important to emphasize here that voting here was not about approval. It wasn't about this is a good research question. It was about the most interesting things, or the ones that the students wanted me to then give feedback on in the class situation. So I use this in the classroom, you know, standing in front of a projector, but it worked very, very well in the online sphere as well. So there's a very low technical barrier for use this. You just scan the code, go to the website and type in your question. And for those students whose research questions rose to the top of the list and I had time to look at in the session, they get very, very personalized feedback. But of course, the whole class gets to learn vicariously, because the principles of designing a research question are the same for everybody, even though the research questions are different. And very importantly, it's anonymous. So it means that people who are too shy to put their hand up and offer their draft research question, which of course is not going to be perfect, in front of 35 of their peers in a class situation, it means that they can still get the feedback without kind of being embarrassed or shy about it. And also importantly, this creates a document. So students later on in the term, when they're revising their research questions and producing much more robust research questions, they can go back and look at all of them and recall, you know, what I talked about at the time in terms of feedback. Menti was something. Now, if this had been a live presentation, I would ask you now to go to this URL and upload some comments, but obviously we can't do that because this is a video. But I used Menti to create these word clouds, these live word clouds. And the situation I chose this tool for was when we were teaching about literature search and how to construct search terms for a literature search. So we asked the students to type in what they might search for if they were looking for something about virtual reality. And you can see from the word cloud here what a varied and extensive set of keywords we came up with. So it's quite good, this tool, for providing live feedback to show just the disparity and the diversity that's possible in literature search keywords. And really the idea of that is to communicate complexity. You know, this is more complex than you think it is when you start out. And therefore we kind of tied this in, is, okay, so how do we create good search terms? How do we really refine our search terms and not just type in the first thing that comes into mind? So I think this was a good tool for that job. And again, it had a very low technical barrier for use. You can just pick up a mobile phone and use this without needing to learn anything. Jamboard is a simple whiteboard tool provided by Google. All whiteboards do this, but the ones that I'm showing you today, you can pre-populate them with your learning content. So in this case, cards talking about how master's research is different from undergrad research, using the Mastersness Toolkit, which is the image you're seeing in front of you. So it retains some of this physicality of moving cards around and kind of almost like handling cards physically. Not really the same, of course, but it preserves some of that element of physicality. Again, it had a low barrier for learning how to use it. And I used Jamboard in particular for this exercise because it was a small group exercise, and I didn't particularly want the small groups looking at each other's material until the end. So each breakout group, it was very easy to set each breakout group up with their own page within the same Jamboard. So it was easy to divide my group into smaller groups using this platform. And once again, it creates a good document for students to go back and look at after the class and return to in future months to revise the material. Miro is another whiteboard tool, a much more complex one with very kind of high functionality and lots of different aspects to it. And it has some playful tools. Now, the difference between this and Jamboard, apart from the kind of high level of functionality, is that it's one big shared space for everyone to work together. So although you can still create different areas on the board for different groups to work, they can always scroll around and look at each other's work. So it's a bit more of a kind of large group tool. I would say as well, it has a much steeper learning curve than something like Jamboard because of its higher level of functionality. And it has a very nice workshop mode that you can see in this image here, where workshop notes can be added as a kind of pop-up area on the screen. So you can type your research notes up in advance and students can kind of follow through the steps of the workshop. And if they don't need this, they can close it and have a bit more screen space for the pictorial content. And I ran a workshop here on risk analysis for research projects using some of the cards from the How to Fail Your Research degree game that I talked about previously. And what I did is I created this familiarization exercise, which you can just about see here, where the students created little sort of cartoon monsters to represent a risk that they thought existed at the start of the workshop. And this doubled up as a way to familiarize them with the platform, with Miro itself. And then we used these little kind of risk monsters in the workshop to reinforce and expand student knowledge and to share knowledge across the whole cohort. An aside here about quizzes in terms of tools. So a quiz is not a game. a quiz is a test, right? So when you're running a quiz for students, and it's a big thing that lots of people do, is to run a quiz as a game, but it's not a game. It's not teaching material. It's testing what students already know. But quizzes can be great for energizing a class, for engaging the whole class at once. It's really good for getting feedback to the tutor. If you're running a live quiz, you can really see what students are getting right and what they're getting wrong. And it makes learning very visible to the students. And I use quizzes a lot, but you need to design them to teach the material, not just to be an exam. And to do this, you need to actually subvert the quiz format. So here's some tips for if you're running quizzes. So use pseudonyms, de-emphasize competition. It's not a test. And we don't want our students to feel embarrassed about coming in last in a quiz format. This is a teaching tool, it's not an exam. Then another tip is to ask questions designed to give you information so that you can tweak your content. So I quite often have a question like, how well do you understand this topic? Not at all, a bit, I need a bit of help, or I completely understand it already. And that helps me to gauge how the students are learning throughout the course. And if you ask the same question at the end of your quiz, it also emphasizes to the students what they've learned in the last, half an hour or however long your quiz is. They can see themselves move from no idea into, I'm beginning to get a grasp of this. Another tip is to ask questions that where all the answers are correct. And I do this in terms of, for instance, I might ask my students what method they're thinking about using on a research project. Now, no method is wrong. All methods have a place in answering research questions. So again, it gives you information about your cohort, and it also helps the students to understand that some, especially in research design, some questions don't have a single correct answer. Again, with reinforcing learning, it's a good idea to ask a question, a blind question, that you're expecting the students to get wrong because you haven't taught that material yet. So you ask a blind question, and then you ask questions designed to prompt and reinforce the learning content that actually teach the learning material. Then you ask the question again, and the idea is that they get it wrong the first time, but then they get it right the second time. And again, that makes their learning very visible, so it's quite satisfying for the students. And of course, everything I've said, I just want to emphasize, embed the learning content within the quiz. Don't use it like a test. Okay, so what did I learn about using digital playful tools for communal learning? So if you frame things as playful activities, they're a really, really good way of getting comprehensive engagement from your whole class and to give you feedback that you otherwise wouldn't get because you're not in the same room as your students. And if you design these activities carefully, then you really can get true collaborative learning from using playful digital activities. Digital tools are really good for documentation, and this is in terms of ongoing collaborations between students, but also for providing platforms for them to go back and revise later on in the course. But I would say that you need to choose your tools and platforms extremely carefully, and you need to plan your learning activities meticulously for them to learn well. And of course, the discussion and the revision and the reinforcement that happens outside of the tool is absolutely crucial. And you can see from my examples that almost all of these activities are prompts for teaching. They don't themselves deliver the teaching alone. They tend to be prompts for the tutor to lead the teaching activity. Okay. That's it for the bonus content. Thanks for watching this video, and I hope you learned something. Once again, all links will be in the description below. So thank you for watching. Bye-bye.